had sort of a rolling start to clergy staff meeting this morning because everybody was running late, and I suspect we may get a few more folks trickling in, but we will love them and welcome them. And a special greeting to the internet world out there. We are so glad to have everyone. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, thank you for the work of the Apostle Paul. Thank you for including us among the believers who have come to know you through him. Bless us as we learn about his story, as we draw near to the close of that story. Grant that we might see our own lives as a chapter opening to continue his work in the world. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Let's take a look at chapter 24, please. Acts chapter 24. Just to give us a little bit of context, Paul is on his journey towards Rome, and the way that he's getting to Rome is that when he got arrested, he has made an appeal to the emperor. And for what reason does he have the authority to appeal to the emperor? A citizen of Rome. Very important, very significant, very valuable, and all of the local regional kings are afraid of getting crosswise with Rome. So Paul makes his appeal and says, I'm a citizen, and the local kings are like, oh my goodness, I don't want to get involved with this, but I also don't want him to be killed. And so you'll remember that his last journey, he was accompanied by 200 Roman soldiers, tasked to keep him safe, because the local leader didn't want the regional leader or the emperor to find out that a citizen had gotten killed on his watch. So we're making our journey towards Rome. Paul is making his appeal repeatedly to the emperor. He's going higher and higher in the system. He's getting the empire to pay for his travel, which is a great thing too, and has 200 soldiers traveling with him. And we pick up at chapter 24. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an attorney called a certain Tertullus, and they reported their case against Paul to the governor. When Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, I'm pausing here because it looks as though Paul is the speaker, but let's carry on and we'll figure this out. 24:2. When Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, Your Excellency, because we have long enjoyed peace, and reforms have been made for this people because of your foresight, we welcome this in every way and everywhere with utmost gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you to hear us briefly with your customary graciousness. We have, in fact, found this man a pestilent fellow, an agitator among the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, so we seized him. By examining yourself, you will be able to learn from him concerning everything of which we accuse him. Let's pause for just a second. The speaker there is that attorney that the priest brought down. Tertullus, the attorney who's representing the elders of the people. That's who the speaker is. So he is saying, we have found this man to be pestilent, a ringleader. And there's one more in there. Pestilent, agitator, ringleader. Not bad things to be described as, if I do say. Picking up in verse 9. The Jews also joined in the charge by asserting that all this was true. When the governor motioned to him to speak, Paul replied, I cheerfully make my defense, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation. As you can find out, it was no more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They did not find me disputing with anyone in the temple or stirring up the crowds, either in the synagogues or throughout the city. Neither can they prove to you the charge that they now bring against me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. I have a hope in God, a hope that they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection, both of the righteous and of the unrighteous. Therefore, I do my best always to have a clear conscience towards God and towards all people. Now, after some years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to offer sacrifices. While I was doing this, they found me in the temple, completing the rite of purification, without any crowd or disturbance. But there were some Jews from Asia. They ought to be here before you to make an accusation if they have anything against me. Or let these men tell you what crime they had found when I stood before the council. Unless it was this one statement that I called out while standing before them, it is about the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. But Felix, who was rather well informed about the way, adjourned the hearing with this comment: when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Then he ordered the centurion to keep him in custody, but to let him have some liberty, not to prevent any of his friends from taking care of his needs. Let's pause there for just a second. Paul, this is an interesting defense from Paul, isn't it? In reading these last several chapters, we've heard him make his defense 3, 4, maybe even 5 times. And each time he goes back to the beginning. And he talks about getting struck down on the road to Damascus. And he talks about being blinded. And he talks about Ananias coming. And then he talks about the way that people had received this teaching in all of his journeys. And he makes his testimony. But here he doesn't. Here he takes that lawyerly approach. So what did they see me doing? Nothing. Let them tell you about the disturbance that they've charged me with creating. Oh, right, they can't. What are they saying? I violated the law? Well, actually, I was up at the temple fulfilling the law. The problem was, I said that there would be a resurrection. And that got me crosswise with the Sadducees. And that got me, my getting crosswise with the Sadducees got me crosswise with the Pharisees. And then once I had both the Pharisees and the Sadducees against me, then they had me arrested. So he actually goes through and makes a defense against the charges themselves rather than just making his testimony. And then look at verse 22. Felix, who was rather well informed about the way. Isn't that interesting? The governor is well informed about the way, about the faith of Jesus that Paul is proclaiming. Isn't that interesting? And then at the end, he says, I'm going to have you sent back into custody until the tribune gets here so that I can review it all with him, but you can have liberty. He's well informed about the way, and he gives Paul liberty in prison. This is the same Paul who had the whole earthquake to let him out. You remember that story? This is the same Paul who gets in trouble all the time, but the governor says, let his people come. Let them take care of his needs. It's not said, but we can imply it. Let them say their prayers with him, and let them have fellowship with one another. Questions or comments or insights about the testimony before Felix? Please.
Not about the testimony before Felix, but last week, just in the footnotes, it said there is nothing in Paul's letters to indicate that he was a Roman citizen.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So the offering is that there's nothing in the letters that confirms his citizenship. I think we have it here in the, I think it's said pretty clearly in Acts, but we don't have it again in the letters. Interesting.
Oh.
We had studied Romans a couple of semesters ago, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but we can, once Paul gets to Rome, we can sort of bring back our knowledge from Romans to think about what is his elegy, his valedictory as he finishes up his ministry. And that's what we see in the letter to the Romans. All right, are we ready to see what happens next? All right, verse 24. Some days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, wonderful name, who was Jewish. Now we know how he's getting all this information. And he sent for Paul and heard him speak concerning faith in Christ Jesus. And as he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present. When I have an opportunity, I will send for you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. And for that reason, he used to send for him very often and converse with him. After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and since he wanted to grant the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So Felix never actually decides the case. The tribune doesn't come, but then he brings his wife over to the prison, where Paul has some liberty, and they sit there and they listen. And she's a devout Jew and has probably told Felix many things about the faith, and he's listening to Paul. He starts to get nervous. And he starts to get nervous. So he keeps him there in prison. Anything else on Felix in this testimony?
You would think after, pardon me, you would think after 2 years that maybe he would realize that Paul wasn't gonna come up with any money to bribe him.
Yes, no bribe is forthcoming, and particularly if you're in prison, you don't have a lot of opportunity to be earning money unless those friends are bringing it with them. Please.
And you said that the Pharisees believed in a resurrection, the Sadducees didn't.
Mhm.
Did they just not believe? Did they think he was lying when he was talking about the resurrection?
Yes, that's a good question. With the Sadducees, when they weren't accepting of the resurrection, I don't think they thought he was lying. I think they thought he was blaspheming. And that to stand up and say there is a resurrection from the dead when they have this core belief that there isn't a resurrection of the dead is and particularly to say it in the temple, it would be the equivalent, use an extreme example, equivalent if I went down to the church one morning and stood up in the pulpit and said, well, Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. That would be offensive, that would be heretical. And the Sadducees felt that he was there proclaiming blasphemous things in the temple. Anything else? All right, let's look at the next level here. So glad you're here. Welcome. Let's look at chapter 25.
Acts 25.
Oh,
Acts 25. Please, Sylvia.
I had a note from, I guess, another class that I've
By
totally
another
forgotten.
by another teacher whose name shall not be mentioned.
And it says that during this 2 years, that was when Paul wrote the book of Romans.
Yeah, not quite yet. Not quite yet, because we haven't made it to Rome.
Oh, okay, well, that's wrong, my note's wrong then.
I think I'm pretty sure the understanding is he did that once he gets to Rome, which is another
Mimsy.
2 chapters. I know. She just likes to skip through to the end, and I want to. The process matters here. All right, Acts chapter 25, please. 3 days after Festus arrived in the province, this is the new governor. After Festus arrived in the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. You always go up to Jerusalem, remember that, where the chief priests and the leaders of the Jews gave him a report against Paul. They appealed to him and requested as a favor to them against Paul to have him transferred to Jerusalem. They were, in fact, planning an ambush to kill him along the way, period. We have heard this before, right? The reason that he has those 200 soldiers is because someone was plotting against him on the way, so this is all being repeated. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, let those of you who have the authority come down with me. If there's anything wrong about the man, let them accuse him there. After he'd stayed among them for not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When he arrived, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem surrounded him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Paul said in his defense, I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against the emperor. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there before me on these charges? And Paul said, I am appealing to the emperor's tribunal. That is where I should be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Now if I am in the wrong and have committed something for which I deserve to die, I am not trying to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can turn me over to them. I appeal to the emperor. Then Festus, after he had conferred with his council, replied, you have appealed to the emperor, and to the emperor you will go. All right, so this is Paul's citizenship at play again. I am a citizen, I have a right to appeal to the emperor, and I choose him. But he's not saying just that, is he? He's saying all these charges against me are completely false. Let them present one bit of evidence. Let them show something to indicate that I've actually done what they say that I've done. And we've now had 2 governors, right? We had Felix and now we have Festus, both of which have had trouble figuring out what's going on. Festus, he's the new guy, right? He's come in. Felix, as a favor to the Jews, has kept Paul in prison, but now Festus has to figure out what to do with him. And so he doesn't call him out. He goes down to Jerusalem and starts asking questions. What did you see? What did you experience? Who bore witness to these crimes? And then he goes to Paul, perhaps knowing that Paul knows that he's been asking all these questions and no evidence has been presented. He said, why don't we do this? We'll just stop this craziness here. We'll all go down to Jerusalem. I will preside your trial. You know that I don't see any evidence, and we'll just deal with it. But what Paul says is, don't hand me over to those people. I'm a citizen. If I've done something that deserves death, let it be so, but also let it be proved. And I'm not going to submit myself to your judgment because there's no evidence. I appeal to the emperor. And now remember that Festus is in the same position that the previous governor was. He doesn't want a citizen to get killed on his watch unjustly. And so he says here at the end of 25:12, you've appealed to the emperor, and to the emperor you will go. Questions, thoughts, comments, insights?
Sir, what
Please.
did Paul do to make the Jews that mad?
That was a good question. We had him in the temple about 2 or 3 chapters ago. And I'm not finding the exact citation. But where he got crosswise with the Sadducees was when he was proclaiming the resurrection of the dead, because that sect didn't believe in it. And he got crosswise with the Pharisees by proclaiming Jesus as the coming Messiah, or the Messiah who had come. And the Pharisees were the temple authorities who were privileged by the current system. So that he was stirring things up, saying things
After
that
killing
seemed...
Christians.
Sorry?
He killed Christians first.
Yes, but that wasn't what got him in trouble here. Yeah, that was earlier. All right, let's take a look at 13. Actually, I'm going to pause for just a second. Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria is where all 3 of your priests trained, and has a chapel which burned about 9 years ago. But in the chapel was a beautiful Tiffany window that unfortunately was lost to the fire. But a beautiful Tiffany window that depicted the scene that we're about to read. And it's Paul making his appeal before the governor. You can find some images of it online. It's absolutely spectacular. But what you have is Paul standing in the court of King Agrippa and Queen Beatrice. And he's standing there with his hands in an open posture, and there are shackles hanging from his hands. And then you've got the king sitting there, and he's got a beautiful sort of peacock feather fan behind him, and Queen Beatrice is sitting next to him on the throne. And he has this expression on his face of intrigue, that he's listening so actively to what Paul says. He's listening, he's leaning in, he's got his hand on his chin. So you have this intent look from this condemned man making his testimony. And what you miss, unless you look very, very closely, or unless an upperclassman points it out to you, is that down on the ground, below the king, is this guy with a quill pen, and he has a bucket next to him. And what he's doing is rewriting everything in the law, because he realizes that everything has changed. And so he's writing as fast as he can and throwing away the paper that doesn't matter. None of that matters anymore because the Messiah has come. Obviously, it's Louis Comfort Tiffany's interpretation of the story. But I'll never forget the image of that little guy with his bucket and his scrolls. And it's just worth bringing up. 25 and 13. After several days had passed, King Agrippa and Queen Beatrice arrived at Caesarea to welcome Festus. Since they were staying several days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a man here who was left in prison by Felix." Let's pause there. My predecessor left this problem for me. I'm doing my best to solve it for you, but my predecessor caused it. Felix left this guy in prison. While I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me about him and asked for a sentence against him. I told them that it was not the custom of the Romans to hand over anyone before the accused had met with the accusers face to face and had been given an opportunity to make defense against the charge. So when they met there, I lost no time, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they did not charge him with any of the crimes that I was expecting. Instead, they had certain points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Since I was at a loss of how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wished to go to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of his imperial majesty, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to the emperor. Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear this man myself." "Tomorrow," he said, "you will hear it." Look at Festus. My predecessor left this guy in prison. I've got all these upset people down in Jerusalem. I said to them, let me bring him down. We'll just get this all worked out. We'll take care of it. Problem gone. And he said no. And you can imagine the king saying, well, that's peculiar. I'd like to hear from this guy myself. And you can imagine the rejoicing in Festus, because now someone else higher up in the system has taken him on. You want to see him? I'll get him for you tomorrow. That'll be no problem. And by the way, when you're writing to the emperor, you tell him that you took the case, because I don't want any part of this. Each level of the hierarchy is less excited about dealing with this problem and is quite glad to pass it on to the emperor. Paul is asking to be passed on to the emperor because he is a citizen, and he's making his way to Rome because he wants the whole world to know the story of Jesus. And you can't do that except from Rome. 25:23. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came, that was Beatrice, I'm sorry. Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then Festus gave the order, and Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all here present with you, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish community has petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and in here, shouting that he should not live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death, and when he appealed to his imperial majesty, I decided to send him. But I have nothing definite to write to our sovereign about him. Therefore I have brought him to all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that, after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner without indicating the charges that are against him. I would add unreasonable and unwise, right? Sending somebody to the emperor, please charge him, please deal with this, but I'm not telling you what he's done because I can't prove it and I don't have any evidence myself. It's complicated. Then Agrippa says to Paul in 26:1, you have permission to speak for yourself. And then Paul stretches out his hand and begins to defend himself. I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa, that I am to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, because you are especially familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg of you, listen to me patiently. All the Jews know my way of life from my youth, a life spent from the beginning among my own people and in Jerusalem. They've known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that I have belonged to the strictest sect of our religion, and I lived as a Pharisee. And now I stand here on trial on account of my hope and the promise made by God to our ancestors, a promise that our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly worship day and night. It is for this hope, Your Excellency, that I am accused by the Jews. Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? Indeed, I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things against the name of Jesus of Nazareth. This is getting back to the persecution that was raised a minute ago. And that's what I did in Jerusalem, with authority received from the chief priests. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison, but I also cast my vote against them when they were being condemned to death. By punishing them often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And since I was so furiously enraged at them, I pursued them, even to foreign cities. With this in mind, I was traveling to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. When at midday, along the road, Your Excellency, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and my companions. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads. I asked, who are you, Lord? And the Lord answered, I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you to serve and to testify to the things which you have seen, me and those in which I will appear to you. I will rescue you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified in faith by me. After that, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and then throughout the countryside of Judea, and also to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God and do deeds consistent with repentance. For this reason, the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. To this day, I have had help from God, and so I stand here, testifying to both small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would take place. The Messiah must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. There's that proclamation that we've heard probably 3 or 4 times now over. He's moved on from sort of making the legal argument. He's got the king in front of him, and he tells him the story. And look at what he's doing. He's tying himself back to his Jewish heritage. I was born as a Pharisee. I lived as a Pharisee. I persecuted Christians under orders of the high priest. All of these things I did. He didn't bring up the holding the coats for Stephen, but he brought that up the last time, that he was the coat boy at the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr of the church. I did all those things. And then I had this experience. And God turned my heart. And after he turned my heart, he said, I need you to tell people what's happened. And since then, your most excellent majesty, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. Martin Luther said before the Diet of Worms, here I stand, I can do no other. Same for Paul. God has asked me to do something. He has persuaded me of this truth. I can do nothing but tell you what it is. Comments on King Agrippa, please. Bill.
Just a little historical note. The emperor that Paul is appealing to is the young Nero, which we would think of as a horrible persecutor of Christians. Why would you appeal to Nero? But Nero was a pretty good emperor in his first few years. He had some very good advisors. And then at some point he decided, I've got this. He got rid of the advisors, and things went downhill pretty quickly.
Oh, that's so interesting. You'll hear what Phil just told me. Yeah, that's excellent. Excellent. Please.
I was struck by how Felix and Festus are behaving the same way Pilate did. I wash my hands of all this.
Yes. There are a whole lot of parallels in the structure of Paul's narrative in the courts and Jesus' narrative. Paul's narrative is much longer and much more extended and has these kind of ripples of appealing through various levels. But it's absolutely the case that the governors are trying to say, it's not me, I wash my hands of all of this, bring your own charges against him, deal with this as Jewish people because it's a Jewish faith issue, not a government issue, all of these things. And we haven't heard the phrase yet, I find no charge against this man, but it certainly has been implied. It has certainly been implied. A lot of parallels here. Paul keeps going back to that critical piece. I'm a Jew, I was raised a Jew, I'm a Pharisee, I persecuted Christians, I had this experience, But nothing I'm saying now disagrees with anything that Moses said. Moses said it was going to happen in exactly this way, and I'm just saying it did. And that's ruffling all these feathers. Phil, I don't know if the next line is as popular in Church of Christ seminaries as it is in Episcopal seminaries, but I know many, many seminarians who put a sign on their dorm room doors that have the following, chapter 26, verse 24. Put a smile in the margin if you'd like. While Paul was making his defense, Festus, who's no longer a party to the argument, remember, Festus exclaims, "Paul, you're out of your mind. Too much learning is driving you insane." You spent all this time studying and learning and reading the scrolls, and you are just out of your mind. You're off your rocker. You come up with all of these wonderful logical patterns, and you just can't see that they're completely senseless. That's Festus's response, and is worthy of our noting. And then Paul says, and remember, he's standing before King Agrippa and Queen Beatrice. Bernice, sorry. Once it's in there, it's in there. He's standing before King Agrippa and Queen Bernice, and Festus is over here, sitting in the sort of observer pews, and he starts saying, and now Paul is turning to address a lower-ranked person while the king is sitting in judgment over him. And Paul says, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking a sober truth." Pause on sober truth for just a moment. Remember back to Acts 2, when the Holy Spirit comes down and everybody starts speaking in tongues, and someone says to Peter, "Y'all are drunk," and Peter says, "We're not drunk, it's only 9:30 in the morning." Another wonderful phrase in there, but there's this idea, are you intoxicated? Is something going on? How could you possibly be thinking these things? And he says, "I am speaking a sober truth." And indeed the king knows about these things, pointing to the king. He's speaking over here, the king is over here. Indeed the king knows about these things. And to him I speak freely, for I am certain that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? I know that you believe. There he is answering the question that he has asked. Do you believe in the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa says to Paul, "Are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christian?" Paul replies, "Whether quickly or not, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today might become such as I am, except for these chains." And then the king got up, and with him the governor and Bernice, and those who had been seated with them. And as they were leaving, they said to one another, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." And Agrippa says to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor." What a great scene. You can see why Tiffany loved it so much to make that window. It says to the king knows all this is true. "King Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? I know you believe in the prophets." Then the king says, "Are you going to persuade me slowly to become a Christian?" Slowly or not, it's my hope that not only you, but the whole of the empire will come to believe, except for these chains. Please.
Agrippa was a Jew and a Roman governor.
That is a good question. Phil, can you help me out on context there?
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. The question is whether he was a Jew and a Roman governor. I don't know.
Well, he was raised in that area, so he knew the Jewish religion.
And I think it was Felix's wife or Festus's wife who was a Jew, who was sort of keeping them involved. So he certainly is in the water there, but I doubt that he himself would be a Jew.
Also, in my notes, it says that he and Bernice were both children of Herod Agrippa.
Yeah, Herod Agrippa, and in this part of that whole family line of Herod.
Would that have been a Jew? That wouldn't have been.
And that would have been like a half Jew or something.
Okay. So there's some Judaism in
Yeah,
the family,
there's
but
some-
perhaps we don't know what their profession is.
It says in this note here that Drusilla, who is Felix's wife, was the sister of Herod Agrippa II and Bernice.
Okay.
So maybe it's their marriage.
Joellen?
I have a footnote that says Agrippa was perhaps not so well acquainted with Judaism, but was not a practicing
There
Jew.
you go. There you go.
What did she say?
She said that the footnote indicates that he would have been well familiar with Judaism, but was not himself a practicing Jew. That's why we have why we study together. We got a brain trust in here. This is fantastic. Fantastic. And then look at that last section there. He could have been set free had he not appealed to the emperor. He could have been set free had he not appealed to the emperor. Whether he actually would have been set free is a totally different question. Because at this point, Agrippa is off the hook, right? He doesn't actually have to make a decision because he's going to the emperor. And when you don't have to make a decision, it's much easier to say what your hard decision would have been. He could have been set free, but he appealed to the emperor. So what we're seeing is persuasion going on here. He's not being dismissed as a crackpot. And the time when somebody said, you are a crackpot, he had this response that got a wonderful answer from the king.
So he's saying he would have been set free right then, we would let him go, but since he wants to go this next step.
Yeah, so take a look at 31, and the quote from King Agrippa. King Agrippa says, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor."
So we would have let him go.
I think what he's saying is, I would have let him go, but I wasn't asked to, so I didn't
Right.
make that decision. And it would be interesting to see whether that actually happened or not.
Seems like it's just the opposite, that they wanted to kill him unless he did appeal to the emperor.
The Jews definitely wanted to kill him, but we've got these Roman governors who are sitting in judgment, and they're the ones who are struggling, because they've got in front of them someone that their populace wants to see killed, but someone who also has Roman citizenship, which means that the bosses in Rome are looking at what they're doing. So they have to balance keeping order in their community with the expectations of the emperor for them. And that's their tough spot.
Do you think Paul knew that Agrippa would come to this conclusion, that if you hadn't appealed to the emperor, you would have been set free? Do you think he knew he was purposefully appealing to the emperor because he knew he wouldn't be set free?
So Don's question is, do we suppose that Paul knew that he could have been set free if he didn't appeal to the emperor? And I don't know. What I would say, though, is that Paul was absolutely persuaded of the truth that he was telling. And I think that he was fairly well persuaded that if laid out for people, he would start to see hearts be changed. And so I suspect that he was expecting some response from the kings or the governors. Because for him, this was so true and so logical and so clearly an extension of the prophets that I think he expected that to be persuasive. And evidence would support him in that. All of these people who heard his testimony that we've been reading about for the last 20 some odd chapters have come to faith through Paul's logical testimony.
And he knows he has to go to Rome.
And he knows he has to go to Rome. And he puts his goal so clearly there. It is verse 29. "I pray to God that not only you, but everyone who is listening to me today might become such as I am, except for these chains." My goal is that the king and everybody who can hear this is going to become a Christian. He lays it out really clearly in that verse. Let's look at chapter 27. Wow, we're getting really close to the end here, friends. Paul's getting to Rome. Let's look at chapter 27. When it was decided that we were to sail for Italy, they transferred Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Embarking on a ship of Adramyttium. Can I have a little support in that, please? Thank you, I appreciate it. A ship of Adramyttium that was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. We put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, we've heard him before, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. Putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. After we had sailed across the sea that is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty at Cnidus. And as the wind was against us, we sailed into the lee of Crete off Salmone. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous because even the fast had already gone by, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and of the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, where they could spend the winter. It was a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest. When a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought that they could achieve their purpose, so they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete, close to the shore. But soon a violent wind called the northeaster. That's from my people. That's great. It's like a little voice from home right here. But soon a violent wind called a nor'easter rushed down from Crete. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Codia, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run on the Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and so were driven. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw cargo overboard. And on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they'd been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete, and thereby avoided this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship." Bum, bum, bum. And he said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor, and indeed God has granted safety to all those who are traveling with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we will have to run aground on some island." Let's pause there for just a second. I love this story. It's just fantastic. First of all, let's look at 27 and 2. Who's we? We set sail.
Luke.
Probably Luke. Yeah, so that's important because we haven't had the we from the narrator a lot recently. So this is kind of new here, and we're getting the idea that there's an eyewitness, a first-person eyewitness who's giving us this account. Now remember, the opening of Luke's gospel, Luke tells us that he's using sources, right? Many others have sought to tell the story of Jesus, and I've reviewed it all, and I'm putting it together. So we have some of Luke's source material. We also possibly have some of his eyewitness material, and he's putting this together for us. But he's crafting a beautiful story. We need to get to Rome, and we remember here in the way this is told how different and how much more dangerous travel was. If I were going to be flying to Rome today, I would insist on not more than one connection, right? I would probably go through Atlanta or Charlotte, go there, hop, go over. But it was much more difficult in those days. We had to find a ship that was going in the right direction. We had to find a captain who was willing to give us passage. We had to find some food to bring on because they weren't going to give it to us. Then we get to the place and the lead guard says, "Oh, you can go and visit the people in that house church that you set up." So we went over there and we did that. Then we came back and it was starting to be winter. And Paul says, "Well, let's just spend the winter here." The winter. Months. Let's spend the winter here, and we'll make it onto the emperor in the spring or the early summer. They said, no, we're going to press on. Maybe we can get it here. They knew it wasn't going to work, but they did it anyway. They get out there, and remember Luke and all of his details? He's setting this in an exact historical place with exact people and exact geography. We went on the leeward side of Crete. We went on the leeward side of this island. The harbor faced this direction and that direction. The wind was coming from the northeast. It was all very clear, very clear. And they get out there, and the storms are raging, raging such that they start to throw the cargo overboard, so all of the people who've paid them to deliver cargo are going to be a problem. Then they start throwing the tackle overboard, you know, the lines and the anchors and all the things that they're going to use to steer the ship, and then they just give up. We're just going to go down. Might as well stop even steering. Does it remind you of anything? Any stories?
Jonah?
Jonah, very good. I was thinking Jesus on the boat in the Sea of Galilee, and the storm swirls up, and he's asleep in the back of the boat, and all the disciples come to him and say, don't you know that we're perishing? Don't you know that we're about to die? And Jesus stands up and rebukes the storm and says, you have little faith. Did you not know that we were going to be fine? Because I have a mission to fulfill and it's not done yet. And we get this angel who appears to Paul, whose story is mimicking Jesus' story, and he says to him, y'all are going to be fine. And Paul stands up and makes his testimony. And isn't that interesting too? All these people who've given up hope, Paul says, the God of the Lord, the angel of the God that I profess, has told me we're going to be fine. And they say, Paul, you're crazy. All you're studying, you've lost your mind. And then when they come out okay, he's got this claim that he gave them in the situation. Wonderful story. Paul says, I have a mission to complete from God, and by golly, I'm going to do it. And by the way, God's going to protect all of you as well. Questions, comments, or insights before we run aground? You know it's going to happen. I mean, it's like coming to Easter service. You know that Jesus is going to get out of it. It's not really in doubt. Anything else on that? 'Let's see what happens. 27:27. When the 14th night has come, as we were drifting across the Sea of Adria, why were they drifting?
They've thrown all their
They'd
stuff
thrown all the
overboard.
stuff over. That's right. They'd thrown all the stuff away. We were drifting across the Sea of Adria. About midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took soundings and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground on the rocks, as Paul said that we would, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day. But when the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless those men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. And the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. You follow that? So the guys are out in the dinghy on the pretext of laying anchors, and the centurion comes and cuts the line. And away you go. I have a wonderful picture of my cousin's dog in the dinghy behind a sailboat in Maine, and we were there trying kind of taking in the sails and packing everything up and doing what you need to do, and the dog's just over there in the dinghy by himself. And I feel the same here. He's out in the dinghy, cut the line, goodbye, you're done. And then just before daybreak, this is 33, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been in suspense and remaining without food and have eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will help you to survive. For none of you will lose a hair from your heads. Why?
You're gonna be saved.
Because the angel of God told me you were going to be saved. And after he said this, he took bread, and after giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Does that remind you of anything? Communion, Last Supper, also possibly feeding of the 5,000 on Galilee with boats around, all of this wonderfulness. He takes the bread, he gives thanks in the presence of all, he breaks it, and they begin to eat. And then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. We were all 276 persons in the ship. Another Lucan detail right there. After they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. Let's pause there. So they're throwing the cargo overboard. They've decided to stop eating, but yet they have enough bread for 276 people to eat their fill after 14 days of fasting. Something's going on here. Something is going on. In the morning, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they had planned to run the ship ashore if they could. They cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. At the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars, and then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the ship aground, and the bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the force of the waves. Escape, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and for the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to the land. I'm going to stop here so we can finish the book tomorrow, but let's just imagine this scene, right? So they're there, they've run aground, the back of the ship is being moved like this, so you're expecting it to break at midships. The Roman guards, realizing that it's going to be on them if the prisoners escape, even though they've already thrown over all the cargo, they've already thrown over all the tackle, they've cut the anchors away, they've cut away their friends in the dinghy, they've done all these things that are going to be problematic for them when they get to Rome, but they know if those prisoners escape, they're going to have a serious problem. So their decision is, we're just going to kill them. I mean, there's a logical pattern there, not a good one, but a logical pattern. Just going to kill him. And Paul said, if it's somebody wanting to save Paul, the centurion, the head of the guard, wanting to save Paul, don't do it. Bad idea. Let's just get out on the beach and we'll figure out what to do. So those who can swim, get in the water. Off you go. And they get in the water and they start to swim. Those of you who can't swim, we got to figure this thing out. And just picture this. Some on planks, some on boards, some on cargo containers of some sort. Paddle, paddle, paddle. It's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. And then they make their way to shore, and amazingly, everyone survives, including the people, thank you very much, who can't swim. And no one dies. Why? Because the angel of the Lord told Paul that the ship was going to go down, but that everyone was going to survive. It's a fabulous story. Fabulous, fabulous story. Questions, comments, or insights on this passage? Please.
The sailors who were trying to escape earlier, Paul said they better stay and not going to be saved. They did just the opposite. They cut the ropes and got rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that contrary?
Maybe they got back on the boat. That's what I would have said.
Let's read it again. What's the verse number on that, please?
30.
31.
30. When the sailors tried to escape from the ship and lowered the boat into the sea on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. You're absolutely right. I had misread that before. So they lower the boat down on the pretext of putting out anchors, but they're going to row away. They're going to leave. And so the centurion cuts the boat loose before they can get into it.
But Paul said they got to stay or we're going to die.
Mm-hmm. So he didn't let them get on the boat.
But I think it's interesting too,
Didn't
they
want to
listen
get
to
on the little
them.
boat.
Yeah, hang on just 1 second. So the dinghy goes down and the guys don't get into it. and then he cuts the dinghy away
Well,
so
they
they
wanted the
can't.
boat in.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Please, Mary Cole.
But they listened to it. I mean, wouldn't you say, I mean, they had a choice, they could have drifted off in that boat, but there was something in them.
So people are really listening to Paul here, and we've got this really interesting thing that, remember, the soldiers wanted to kill all of the prisoners, but it's the centurion guard who says, no, don't do it. Not that one. Not that one there. It's the leaders saying, we could have set him free, but he made his appeal to the emperor. People are really listening to what Paul has to say and are really cautious not to just be the one who kills him. Yeah, very good observations. All right, so here's where we leave ourselves as we end a 28 chapter book, or come up on the end, which we have been studying since the beginning of the year?
Oh, yeah.
Is that right? Maybe even a little bit before. I know we finished Luke's gospel and then rolled right into Acts. So this has been a long journey with us and Paul. We have had the conversion of the Gentiles. We've had the spreading of the church. We've had this interesting Pauline story that parallels Jesus' story. And where are we now as we approach the last chapter, which we will do tomorrow? So where are we at this moment?
Shipwrecked.
We are shipwrecked. We're on an island that we don't recognize. We've got Roman guards and prisoners and other passengers, and we have no hope of rescue. And that's where we're going to pick up next week. But just pause so I can tell you one last little bit of joke, because I need to in my last minute. It's my minute. It's my minute. So there's a man stranded on a desert island for years and years and years and years. And one day, a naval vessel passes by. And it's the first time that he's seen another human being in 10 or 20 years. And the naval vessel sees him waving on the beach, and they send a little dinghy over, not one that got cut away. They send a little dinghy over in a rescue party. And the leader of the rescue party says, how did you ever survive? And he said, well, you figure it out. You figure it out. You see these buildings here, this is the building where I eat, and this is the building where I sleep, and you just kind of figure it all out. And I said, this is my church. I even built a church where I could worship. And the captain of the rescue party said, well, that's just fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And what's that building over there? He said, oh, that's where I used to go to church, but I don't get along with them anymore. We'll see you back next week. I'm so glad you came.